This program is The Future of Energy, the Rational Middle, and World Affairs Councils of America is extremely delighted to present this panel, and we are grateful to the support of Shell, to Amanda Vitulli, Fred Palmer, Greg Guidry, who I'll introduce on the panel in a moment, for their excellent support of this conference, and also to Gregory, Kallenberg, and the Rational Middle Energy Series team. Without their support, this program would not be possible. This conference is grateful. And also, we are tremendously excited that early in the new year, we will be able to offer to the network up to 8 council programs based on this same film and discussion series. So it's an excellent opportunity to find out what the rational middle is all about in your local areas, because energy and the environment, as we know, is one of the hottest topics that's going to drive our policy making and our lives in the 21st century. So with that, I would like to introduce this distinguished panel. First of all, to my immediate left is Gregory Kallenberg. He is the director and producer of the Rational Middle Energy Series. Before starting on this project, which has gone through 2 iterations already of over 20 episodes, Gregory directed and produced Haynesville, A Nation's Hunt for an Energy Future, a documentary that chronicles a large natural gas discovery in northwest Louisiana and its effect on 3 individuals' lives. Gregory has spoken about the future of energy at engagements across the globe, including TEDx, Bucknell University's Environmental Symposium on Shale Gas, and Rice University's Distinguished Speaker Series. To Gregory's left is Alan Krupnick, Director for Resources for the Future. He directs RFF's Center for Energy Economics and Policy, and he's a senior fellow at the center, at RFF. Alan's own research focuses on analyzing environmental and energy issues, in particular the benefits, costs, and design of pollution and energy policies, both in the United States and in developing countries. He's the lead author for Toward a New National Energy Policy, Assessing the Options. And Alan has been a consultant to state government, the European federal agencies, private corporations, state governments, Canadian government, European Union, the World Health Organization, and the World Bank. Next to Alan, on his left, is Greg Guidry, who for 31 years has made his career at Shell. Greg is now Executive Vice President for Shell's Unconventionals business in Upstream Americas, a position he assumed in January 2013. The Unconventionals business in the Americas is primarily focused on tight shale, oil and gas, onshore exploration opportunities, development and production in the United States, Canada, and Latin America. Prior to that role, Greg has run Shell's upstream activities in Europe, where he led Shell's exploration and production activities in 8 countries. I'm not going to list them all, but they're all over. To Gregory's left is Alice Madden. As Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental and External Affairs at the Department of Energy, Alice serves as the interface between the Department of Energy and state, local, and tribal governments and other relevant constituencies. She fosters an active dialogue with stakeholders and constituencies to ensure that their views are considered as part of DOE's decision-making process. Prior to coming to the Energy Department, Alice was the Timothy E. Worth Chair in Sustainable Development at the University of Colorado, where she worked to advance clean energy economy while cultivating a higher level of interest among female and minority students in working in sustainable fields and completing degrees in STEM disciplines. And finally, we have Stephen Eule. I have too many names here. Stephen is Vice President for Climate and Technology at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Institute for the 21st Century Energy. Stephen oversees the collection and analyses of data in energy and climate and the impact of technology in the energy industry. He represents the U.S. Chamber in the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change and helped found the Major Economies Business Forum on Energy Security and Climate Change, which is a coalition of national cross-sector business organizations from major economies for which the Energy Institute acts as a secretariat. He has a long career in government, both on Capitol Hill and also for the Department of Energy in a variety of roles. This panel's awesome. Let's start with Gregory to tell us about what Rational Middle Energy Series is all about.
Thank you, Bill. We good on the mic? Okay, good.
No, I can't hear you.
Good. There we go. Sorry about that. Is that good? Is that better? Hello? How about that? How about we just go commando on the lavalier? I do want to thank Bill and thank you guys for having us here. I do want to say that last night we had a fire alarm at the Palomar Hotel, and all I could think about was those damn merry pranksters at the World Affairs Council. At it again. I was expecting to have some sort of picture of myself on Facebook with hashtag impressive bedhead. So I am the director and producer of The Rational Middle. And The Rational Middle, as Bill said, is this series of 22 films about energy. And, you know, The Rational Middle was born out of this experience we had with Haynesville, which was watching people come to a film really wanting to know more about energy in general. And I think that if there was something that was the most frustrating to me was watching people argue about an issue they knew really very little about or getting information from very bad sources. We were lucky enough to meet Shell at the Aspen Ideas Festival, and they allowed us to have editorial control and have independent fact-checking. And it's been an amazing ride for us. You know, these films, you know, have grown to a point where there's this very strange momentum that's growing around it. And I was talking to Steve earlier this morning about how energy's become this huge issue, which is, you know, it's interesting to me, but it's also kind of wondrous in the sense that energy should be probably the most important issue to all of us because it's so essential to our lives and our lifestyles, and it touches everything we do. Energy is why we have illumination in this room and why my voice is finally being amplified through this microphone. The Rational Middle just recently, just if you're wondering about that momentum, just recently passed 2 million views on our website, which is pretty astounding. I mean, all of our stuff is free to download through rationalmiddle.com, and you know these aren't videos of cute little kittens playing on pianos. You know, these are energy films, and they have real depth and real grit to them. Also, our videos are now amongst the highest tier on YouTube as far as retention rate. So people are watching 10 to 12 minute videos with some of these wonderful experts up here included, you know, and taking these in and thinking deeper about that issue. But what's the most exciting to us is that we're seeing tens of thousands of downloads of the films. And anecdotally, we always, at least once a week, run into an email where someone has actually utilized these videos to bring them into their community, into their policy meeting, into a board meeting to help really level that playing field, help establish that foundation of information, to really get that conversation going. Because, again, the Rational Middle is not about everyone agreeing. It's really about everybody understanding an issue. And so hopefully we've been successful, and hopefully we're going to have a great conversation up here. I got to tell you, it's an amazing panel. What we're going to do is we're going to see the film What's at Stake first. We're going to have a little conversation up here on the panel, and then we're going to see the Great Transition, sort of, you know, the What's at Stake framing, sort of, you know, where we are, and then the Great Transition talking about the future, and then we're going to go to your questions. So again, thank you for having me here. You guys, thanks so much for being here, and you guys, thanks so much for having us. So let's go to the first film, and we'll kind of see what happens.
Alice is the only one in the room who brought popcorn.
Absolutely,
but here
popcorn.
we go.
But she didn't bring enough for everybody.
Founded based on an abundance of land, an abundance of space, an abundance of opportunity, an abundance of social mobility, and, when it came time, an abundance of energy.
Energy is an essential input into our quality of life. It's an essential input into our economy. How do we meet those growing energy demands while at the same time meeting some other key challenges? The environmental challenge, addressing the security issues that surround energy.
The problem here in the United States is that people don't know where energy comes from. We want to flip on our light switches, we want to turn the ignition in our automobiles, and we want to use energy without understanding the consequences.
We import a huge amount of our oil from other nations, and that relates to energy security because we don't have control over that oil.
There have only been these very few times of national emergency, that we've ever thought about our energy supply. So what are those times? 1973 oil crisis, we had to get in line.
The gas wasn't there. There were even days and odd days when you could go. There were long lines. America truly was held hostage. The economy was brought to its knees.
Another example more recent is what happened in, say, 2007 and 2008, when the price of oil went from about $70 up to about $148.
We're not on a path where we choose our own destiny in petroleum, and in fact, many of the regimes and countries that control that petroleum are not friendly to this nation. The only choice we can make is to move ourselves away from oil.
All energy sources have costs associated with them. Those costs come in different forms. There's the costs that come with dollar signs attached to them. You know, how much we pay for gasoline at the pump, how much we pay for our electricity. There's the costs that don't have dollar signs attached to them. Those tend to be environmental costs.
It's virtually incontrovertible that the climate is warming. The evidence is so profound and so comprehensive that that really is not a discussion.
The big question that people still debate is how much warmer and what will the consequences be for people. We know a lot more than we did even a decade or two ago, but there's always going to be uncertainty remaining.
We put stuff into the atmosphere, whether it's the traditional pollutants or carbon dioxide, without recognizing that on some level, some generation in the future is going to have to pay for that, if not our generation.
At least currently in the United States, we don't have a comprehensive climate policy. So while there is a cost to emitting carbon dioxide emissions and a cost to emitting greenhouse gas emissions in the form of increased risk of global climate change, we don't face that economic cost directly.
I don't believe that we will, have one apocalyptic day. I think we will gradually erode our quality of life and the security of our economic well-being until something happens that really shocks the system. Then I think we will act. But the question is that how deep is the hole we've dug before we have to climb back out of it?
It's really about the profound impacts that we are having now. 7 billion people, the doubling of the need of energy on this planet over the course of the next few decades, the doubling of the need that we're going to have to produce food to feed a growing population. This is not just about some kind of blind, feel-good sort of thing. This is about where we're going globally, with more people living more prosperous lives, trying to do more things. The pressure is on, and we have to produce more with less consequence, not just because of climate change, but because of planet change.
There's a responsibility there in terms of making sure that whatever it is that you're doing to produce energy, whether it's drilling oil and gas wells, mining coal, using wind power, using solar, whatever it is that you're doing has an environmental consequence. And the goal ought to be to minimize the environmental impact.
But at the end of the day, a lot of this is really on my shoulders and your shoulders, because we are ultimately the consumers of the energy. But for some reason, we don't understand that. We grow accustomed to having relatively readily available supply. And when you think about all that, you become aware of why we feel the way we feel about energy. It's always been there.
We have this, great possibility of having, cheaper electricity and the ability to sustain our economy and our economic growth with resources that are produced right here in the United States.
If we could address the environmental challenges while simultaneously doing so in a way that people think is economically affordable, is politically feasible, and also addresses energy security concerns, that's where the solutions lie.
If we put our mind to it, the whole energy infrastructure that we have today could be completely changed into a low-carbon energy future just through technology.
We are now starting to see some of these technologies mature on a commercial level. And investors are comfortable enough now with these technologies that investment in renewables has surpassed fossil fuels for the first time in 2011.
At the moment, those energies like wind and solar are more expensive than hydrocarbons. And we will develop technology as we go along, which will make these sources of energy more efficient and cheaper.
We need to take a very measured approach. We need to understand that winding down our dependence on fossil fuel is not something that's going to happen overnight, but is going to take place over decades.
These are true 21st century globalized issues, problems, challenges that we now confront that require 21st century globalized solutions.
The question is whether that will be our priority or not, and that's the challenge.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to kind of start the conversation here, and we'll going to do a few questions here, and then we'll go into the second film. On a scale from 7 to 10, how cinematically compelling was this film? No, I'm kidding. So I mean, let's talk a little bit about how important it is that we start walking towards an energy future. And why don't I go to you, Steve? We were talking a bit about it at the beginning, but I mean, how important is it that we start moving towards something? And I think that really another part of it is, I was talking to Alan yesterday, and he was, of course, needling me on being more specific with my questions, and really kind of focusing on either affordability, sustainability, environmentally responsible. How important is it that we start moving that way?
Can you folks hear me? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's very important, obviously. But you know one thing I think we have to recognize is that the transition, the energy future, is not going to be necessarily driven by the government. What we've seen here in the United States, something no one expected, the shale revolution. And the shale revolution took place because of 3 technologies: hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, and advanced seismic imaging. Those 3 technologies helped propel the U.S. Forward in oil and gas production. We're now the 2nd largest oil and gas producer, actually the 2nd oil producer in the world and the 1st in gas production in the world. And this came about totally unexpectedly. So when we talk about the energy future, I think we have to take into consideration the fact that technology is very disruptive. If you talk to oil company executives 5, 6, 7 years ago, nobody expected the oil and gas revolution in the United States, yet it occurred. And I will say it occurred all on private land, not on federal land. All this activity took place on private land, and there's a reason for that. So when we look to the future, I mean, there are other technologies that are in development that, if they come to fruition, could have a huge impact on the energy future. And I'll just give you one example: energy storage. When you talk about renewables, they're intermittent. You don't get any wind power when the wind doesn't blow, and you don't get any solar power when the sun doesn't shine. But when the sun and wind are shining and blowing, what you need to do is be able to harness that energy and store it, so when they aren't shining and blowing, you have that energy available. If you can develop large-scale energy storage, it makes renewables much more attractive. So my point is that we can plan for the energy future, but technology is very disruptive. And as the great physicist Niels Bohr once said, it's very hard to make an accurate prediction, especially about the future. So when we think about the future of energy, we always have to keep in the back of our mind that advances in technology, unexpected advances in technology, can change the trajectory dramatically.
Alan?
So I agree that the private sector can do a lot to determine our energy future, and because of these innovations, we do have a revolution on our hands in cheaper forms of energy, particularly natural gas and also homegrown oil. But what the private sector can't do is deal with the challenge of global warming, as you saw in the film. And so the United States, after a long and frustrating period of trying to develop climate policy — I was back in the Clinton administration you know, many years ago when we started a climate action plan, and that sort of never really did get off the ground. So finally now we have a proposal from the Environmental Protection Agency to control carbon dioxide emissions from power plants, both new and existing power plants. But this is going to be highly litigious, very controversial. But this is the challenge, the environmental challenge of our age, and the government and the people behind, the people of our country need to be behind the government in its work to reduce these emissions. We're fortunate in a way that cheap energy can help us to a degree meet climate goals more cheaply, to the extent that we can substitute out more expensive energy for cheaper energy, particularly if that energy has less carbon content. And this is the direction we hope to go.
Greg, so what is that importance of walking towards an affordable, sustainable, environmentally sound energy future?
Yeah, Greg, let me just first, a bit of context. You may say, why in the hell is a Shell on a panel talking about transitions to other forms of...
That was my follow-up.
Yeah?
No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. And so I want to start with that because that's the question that probably most people in the room have. And I think, and it's the context for my answer around why is it so important that we start now. These transitions take incredible long time spans. Technology innovation cycles 20 to 30 years before market penetration. Even with fossil fuel technologies, it takes a long time for these transitions to happen. The message that I have, and it's what we're doing, it's our focus, is knowing that energy demand will more than double by the middle of the century, knowing that population will increase on the order of 30% in that same time frame, and knowing that about 35% of the world today does not even have energy, doesn't even have access to energy. It is going to take all forms of energy to supply that demand. And so our responsibility, because we're primarily focused on fossil fuels, is how can we apply technologies to reduce the carbon emissions of the fossil fuels that we have. And those technologies take time to evolve, just like the renewable technologies take time to evolve. And so carbon capture and sequestration is an example of a technology that can dramatically affect the impact that fossil fuels have on the environment. It needs to evolve. We're certainly committed to evolving that technology and are actively doing that. But my overall message is I don't think anyone is proposing that only by the middle of the century fossil fuels will not have still a significant role to play. The question is, how can we reduce the impact of fossil fuels in that time frame and get the technologies evolved to the point where we can do that responsibly?
Sure. Alice?
So I'm at the Department of Energy, but when we first met, I played a different role. I was a majority leader in the state of Colorado and worked with Governor Bill Ritter to lead Colorado from really one of the states that lagged the country in terms of renewable energy and efficiency measures to one that was leading it. And we did that by really bringing people together, and that's not covered in the press very much because it's not as exciting. But there truly is a rational middle in state legislators. That's how things get done. But you just don't often hear about the success stories because they don't sell as many papers or have many hits on the internet. The Department of Energy really focuses on vetting new technology, commercializing new technologies, and with an all-of-the-above strategy. You have to be an optimist to work in climate change, I think, and I remain very optimistic. I think technology is going to make amazing advances. It already has. We had a utility system that was the same forever, and suddenly overnight the world was turned upside down. We now have the possibility to have little generations of energy all over the country versus one big power source for an entire city or community. So things have changed so much that the policies aren't keeping up with the technology. That's really one of our biggest problems. So the reason I'm at the Department of Energy is to work with mayors, governors, external stakeholders who work in this arena, to be able to come together and think about how can we help private sector make their commercial processes more energy efficient. It saves them money, less load on the base load on the utilities, so maybe we don't need to build another coal plant. I mean, think about this from many different angles. There's no one solution to this, obviously, but no matter what you care about, you need to care about it. There's something for everyone. I mean, it's economic, it's global competitiveness, it's health, it's public safety. I mean, we have to move forward, and no matter what your interest is, education, STEM, this is a jobs creation dream come true, except we're not educating our women and minorities to go off and work in the sciences. So no matter what your interest area is, there's a reason why you should care about this.
And before we jump into the second film, I always, when we talk about these things, we're also U.S. or North American centric. What is the role that the rest of the world kind of plays or needs to play in sort of creating that energy future, or at least helping sort of sustain, whether it be policy or adopt technologies? I mean, what are some of the things that the rest of the globe needs to sort of participate with us on? Alan?
Well, that's a complicated question, and it's kind of country specific. I think about China as a rapidly growing, very coal dependent country. So huge amounts of carbon dioxide emissions. They've surpassed the United States on that basis, although not on a per capita basis. We're still the kings there. And the Chinese see this shale gas revolution just the way we do, and they're trying to they're beginning to develop their shale gas resources, which will be good for the economic health of those countries. And they'll be able, and other countries are in the same boat. Some countries in Africa have the ability now, have these resources, and could potentially develop inexpensive natural gas to meet their electricity demands. And they have as much right as we do in the United States to enjoy the benefits of cheap energy. Or the benefits of even energy, electricity. So we're glad that that's happening, but of course at the same time we do have these, the global warming problem and the CO2 emissions that occur. Interestingly, back in China, the Chinese are most concerned about their air pollution, their conventional air pollution. You've probably by this time all seen the scenes of where you can't see, and I've experienced it myself, where I can't see across the street in Beijing or in Tianjin or other of their major cities because of smog. And so to some degree at least, in trying to reduce their conventional air pollutant emissions, to reduce the health impacts, which are severe, they will also end up reducing CO2 emissions. So that's sort of a positive story. We could tell many negative stories, but that's a positive story for China.
Alice?
So you all probably read that there was a UN meeting in New York not too long ago, and there was a focus on climate as part of that. The president was there. The United States is playing a bigger and bigger role in the international talks on climate. There's a meeting in Lima in December, a UN meeting, and then next year is the big meeting in Paris. Our Secretary Moniz, he's a nuclear physicist. He's an amazing man, and he's very much involved with something called the Energy Ministerial, which is an international focus on climate. So the United States, I think, is learning to also tell the state stories, because there's been so much progress in the states when you think about California, which is almost like talking about a different country, with their big economy, and they have the ability to move things forward. So the State Department is very interested in gathering the stories of what cities and states are doing, because that's where greenhouse gases are being reduced. So it's still a complicated and large puzzle. I think the President's Climate Action Plan is geared toward being able to let the world know that we are serious about this, and we're going to take as many measures as we can to reduce greenhouse gases.
Greg?
Yeah, just really quick, I think one area is urbanization. And if you look at particularly in India and China, of course, the way folks will access energy is in moving.
I think that's our cue.
Yeah, is in moving to cities, and so the urbanization that's happening today and over the next over the next decades is going to be incredible. A statistic, every 3 months or so, a city the size of a major U.S. city is evolving. So the question is, are those cities going to be set up as efficient cities, or as cities that exist today in the U.S., for example? And so I think there is an urgency, because efficiency is actually probably the actual most effective thing that we can do. And so is it going to be built in an inefficient way or an efficient way? That's going to have a huge impact on the demand over the time frame.
Cool. Steve, do you want to add something quickly?
Yeah, 3 quick points. First, I don't think we're going to have an energy future. I think we'll have energy futures. So I think what works in China and what works in Europe and works in South America are going to be completely different things based on the resources that they have and the policies they put in place. The second thing is, when we start talking about climate, California was raised as an example. California has some of the highest electricity rates in the country. And when you look at what's going on in Europe, same thing. European electricity rates are much higher than they are in the United States. Natural gas costs to industry in Europe are 3 to 4 times higher than they are in the United States. And so competitiveness is becoming a much bigger concern for a lot of countries. And when you talk to people in the developing world, they'll be quite frank with you, and they say, we're more interested in developing our economy and lifting our people out of poverty than we are about addressing climate change. And until that changes, and I think the only way it changes is through technology. Until that changes, you're not going to see a whole lot of progress on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, the geopolitical aspect of what's going on here in the United States. If you think of the United States, the revolution in oil and gas we have here in the United States because of shale, you have oil sands in Canada. Canada is now a very big and growing energy producer. And in Mexico, they've recently initiated a constitutional reform to get their energy sector moving again. The center of energy gravity in the world is shifting from the Middle East to North America, and that's a very exciting prospect for us.
Cool. And now we're going to go to the Great Transition, and then we'll go back to panel questions.
Our energy crossroads brings together energy security, national security, economic security, and environmental security.
We need to change the way our economy is designed, the way we move around the country, the way we power our economy in a way that's sustainable for 200 years, not just for the next 20.
We've got to get on with it. We've got to break the gridlock over this and move forward with the choices, trade-offs, technologies that are required. A clean energy future is a remarkable thing to think about, and it exists. It means doing less of the really dirty stuff and doing that first. It means doing more of the clean stuff, and that's using more natural gas in place of coal for now. It means using more renewable energies over time.
Renewables have a huge potential, but we have to be realistic. I have to think about how am I going to transition to that at a massive scale.
When you get into the discussions about wind and solar and things like that, you're talking about, on the order of 1.5% to 2% of the total energy mix, which leaves you sitting there scratching your head thinking, wow, we've got a lot of room to really sort of increase that renewable footprint.
The issue with renewables, and the reason they're really unable to take the place in our power generation of these other sources is they're transient. They only generate power when the sun's shining or the wind blows, etc.
The intermittency issue is enormous for renewable energy technologies. So while renewables are theoretically limitless, they are not there all the time. So you have to have backup, or you have to have ways of managing the intermittency of wind or solar.
So sort of the holy grail in the electricity market would be, commercial scale battery technology. If you had that, then all these issues about intermittency go away.
Well, one thing you could do is put fast-acting natural gas backups online, whereas the wind dies down or the solar dies down, you ramp up your natural gas in response. So natural gas is really a great partner for renewables because the variability of renewables matches well with the fast response time of natural gas.
For moderate emission reductions, natural gas can play a very important role. So you can get 50% reductions in your emissions relative to coal through natural gas. So right away, if you think of a transition where you have targets that are 50% or so, you can do that through natural gas.
But still is producing greenhouse gases, still is contributing to the warming of the Earth. And if we are going to make an eventual pivot away from these sources of energy so that we really address global warming, we're going to have to move past natural gas too.
So that gives you a sense of some of the challenges we face, but it means that we need to take a comprehensive approach. It means that you have to be patient, but at the same time it means that if you don't start the ball rolling in a particular direction, you'll never make any progress.
We have to develop the technology. We have to sort of have a plan. Long-term R&D effort, like President Kennedy, we're going to the moon. You know, we're going to solve this energy problem. Here's how we're going to do it, right? We need to be realistic that we're going to use fossil fuels now, because in the end, we are. So right now, in our 2 to 5 year plan, our focus needs to be on energy efficiency and conservation.
Government has to regulate standards of energy efficiency right across the board, from cars through appliances to homes. The more difficult part is on the supply side, where we need more renewable energies and we need to make that work with our existing fossil fuels, and we need to change our networks in order to make that happen.
What is at the other end of that transition? Where are we going? Well, where we're going, you hope, is a clean energy future where renewables are cheap and highly efficient, where dispersed power, solar, wind, can be driving communities, not just single homes, where nuclear power or natural gas or something on that scale is humming cleanly and cheaply. So that bridge needs to be strong and needs to be serious and needs to be better than what we were doing before.
So then we think about how do you move from those greenhouse gas intensive fuels toward a system that's a lower carbon economy. You have to think about the fact that the installed infrastructure for this energy system has been put in place over many, many decades. It's trillions and trillions of dollars. It takes time to turn over that infrastructure.
When you look at the enormous amount of investments that have been poured into this sector globally, those investors are telling us that they believe these technologies are the future, that they can make money, and that they are the most important business drivers in the energy sector today.
I also think a clean energy future is a future where we're using options for energy that we don't talk about yet, where we've allowed innovation and people who are driven by their own self-interest to invent new and different ways to power our economy.
If those technologies include electricity storage, then renewable energy could play even a larger part, because then you could store the electricity that comes from the wind or the sun and use it when the wind wasn't blowing and the sun isn't shining.
This is something that's achievable over the time frame of several decades. So we're talking about a goal that you might put in place by the year 2050.
But it's one that delivers payoffs much sooner than that. There are steps we take, we become somewhat less vulnerable over time. But in the end, if you want to get to a system that is not putting out carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's not dependent on global oil markets, that is a very long time off in the future.
You know, in spite of everything, I'm optimistic. Think about 20 or 30 years ago. The world was incredibly different. The technologies were incredibly different. That will happen again. We just need to make sure that that change is directed at transitioning ourselves from a fossil fuel dependent economy to a low carbon economy, and it'll happen.
It is important to recognize that we are all joined here by a common future, and that we need to work together to make it a better situation for all of us. It certainly is within our power, It may take some initial sacrifices and patience. In other words, I mean a long-term holistic perspective. But I believe that with sound policy, supported by technology and essentially political will, we can certainly create a better future for our descendants.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. So why don't we, we're going to actually create the energy future and lay the path in about 10 to 15 minutes. We're going to totally figure it out for everybody, and then we're going to go to your questions as soon as we're done. Starting with you, Steve, what does like an energy future look like? You know, and again, thinking about sustainability, affordability, environmental responsibility, and what kind of timeline are we looking at?
I think the timeline is a very long timeline, just simply because of the fact that these facilities take a long time to plan and they last for decades once they're built. I want to make one point about the film. I thought it was interesting. Nuclear power was mentioned once in the film. Renewables were mentioned again and again and again, but the simple fact is our largest source of emissions-free power in the United States is nuclear power plants. And it takes a long, long time to build a nuclear power plant, to get it licensed and permitted, and they're very, very expensive to build. But we have a lot of experience with nuclear power. And I think when people talk about an energy future that's sustainable and that results in reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, nuclear has to be part of that equation. I mentioned earlier energy storage. That was brought up in the film. I think energy storage technology has to be successful if we're going to see large penetration of renewables. And the third point I would make is I often hear that natural gas is a bridge fuel. The natural gas is the bridge from the fossil fuel to the renewable and low emission technologies. I got to tell you, the way things are moving now, natural gas is not a bridge, it's a superhighway. And I don't think we're going to see natural gas go away anytime soon. There's just too much of it. It's just too easy to get. And not just the United States, all over the world, there's a lot of natural gas. So natural gas is here to stay for a long, long time.
Alice?
So I'll talk about efficiency a little bit. Someone else brought it up, and there was a term that I can't take credit for, but the negawatt with an N. The cheapest form of energy we use is the one we don't actually use. So I'll just give you one example. And this is something I'm trying to work on, working with mayors and governors across the country to convert all of our street lights to LEDs. If we converted our public lighting to LEDs, we'd save 40 million metric tons of carbon. And millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of taxpayers' dollars as well. And that money could be, to use to fill in potholes and things that actually, people care about every day. It also changes the color of the light. So it's a public safety aspect. We're right now putting lights in Detroit, in one of the highest crime neighborhoods, where they didn't even have lights, by the way, because Detroit was bankrupt. So those lights will they'll have a full color array, so people can have their, walking around and not feeling like they were going to be assaulted, which was happening just months before. So these are things that can happen for many reasons. The other thing I really think that is important is to allow people choices and options that make sense to them to make their homes more efficient. Again, these aren't necessarily sexy. We haven't really talked about this at all, but it's these small measures that will make a huge difference on what we require for our base load. So helping businesses and residents make the existing building stock in this country more efficient is huge. We're doing a much better job building efficiently right now. As far as energy storage, it's an incredibly important point. There's now a utility scale solar entity in Nevada that has 6 hours of storage through molten salts. It's something DOE helped start. So I know it we'll go on and the other folks will mention some other things, but going back to nuclear energy, DOE has a $4 billion loan program right now geared toward nuclear energy, and the new thing in nuclear is what they call small modular reactors. So think modular home, much cheaper to build because they are incredibly expensive. Oftentimes takes a lot of water, so that also, determines where maybe a nuclear plant can be. We have $4 billion in carbon capture and sequestration in loan programs, and another $4 billion in renewables. So we have to look all across the board. But again, I think The technologies are there, and we have to have our elected officials catch up with what is possible.
Greg?
Yeah, I think the key for me is that in terms of the future, it's reinforcing the and not the or, and the path being much more of a collaborative approach than what largely it has been. And what I mean by that, you mentioned gas. In the film, it mentioned the synergy between gas and solar and wind to address the intermittency issue. Huge opportunity, but is there enough collaboration going to really try and make that happen, as opposed to it's got to be either this or it's got to be that? And I think there's going to be a whole lot more collaboration required because there's a whole lot more creativity if we focus on the and as opposed to the or. Because the reality, as I mentioned earlier, in a global context, there are 3 billion people in the world right now out of the 7 billion that do not have access to modern energy. So we're already starting in a deficit where, you know, and how do we decide who doesn't get energy if we're trying to think about what are we going to turn off, what are we going to stop using, right? That's a very difficult question, and one that I don't think you know, we're going to be allowed to do because of that insatiable demand primarily in China and India and other places.
Alan, yeah, a timeline, and if you could put a timeline in there too, I'm curious about it.
Okay, well, I want to say something else first, though, if you don't mind, Greg, which is this. We've been talking a lot about technology here, and technology can save the day. We've been talking about, you know, a few billion from DOE and supporting carbon capture and sequestration, storage, and so on. The most important thing to do would be to unleash innovative forces through pricing carbon. If entrepreneurs could make a lot of money by innovating in ways that would reduce carbon because it's economically advantageous to do so, then we would have significant innovation across the board. In Europe, which does essentially have a price on carbon, that price, they issued so many permits that the price is so low that there's very little innovation incentive there. In the United States, as I mentioned, we have this plan, EPA's plan. They couldn't get a cap and trade plan through Congress, so, you know, we're stuck with this sort of halfway measure. So that'd be the most important thing that we could do to ensure a low carbon future. Now, as to the timeline, in the short term, over the next couple of decades, as Steve was saying, the shale gas revolution is really fundamental. It's going to happen worldwide. We're going to have cheap gas. So the question is, in a global warming perspective, can the industry reduce its carbon, it's methane emissions, what's called fugitive methane emissions. So when natural gas is substituting for coal, will natural gas actually produce less global warming than coal? And this is a central element. And the industry is thinking about this, and EPA in maybe a couple of weeks is coming out with new regulations to reduce methane from natural gas and oil production. So this is critical in the shorter term and that's maybe what you can mean by natural gas being a bridge to a low carbon future if natural gas emissions of global warming gases can be reduced. But in the longer term, there is really no doubt about this from people who model the future. Natural gas is not in the long-term mix to meet global climate change goals. That is, the IPCC, the big group worldwide, has set a limit of 2 degrees Celsius increase in global warming, in global temperatures, average temperatures. To get to that point, which we're almost at even now, you cannot have fossil fuels in any significant way in the energy mix. So in that sense, natural gas is a very very weak, rickety bridge to that longer term low carbon future that we seek.
So, you know, I'm curious, we've sort of danced around this idea of I mean, you know, the roles that we all need to play as we've all kind of constructed these individual sort of plans, futures for energy. What are the roles that you know, one, the public needs to play, two, the corporations need to play, and three, the government needs to play and sort of help enact these things that we're all talking about? Greg, you want to start with that?
I think the first thing is to be better informed, and I think you know, something like the rational middle approach or other approaches that are similar to that, because you know, many times I engage in it you know, and as from an industry perspective, you know, we have not done our part in the past to educate near as much as we probably should have, but I think that's you know, be better informed and be in a position to be much more positioned to collaborate, be much more open to challenge, be much more open to discussion. I don't know that you know, Shell would have been on a panel such as this 10 years ago, right? That's much more of that needs to happen, and because it's going to take that kind of collaboration in order to build political will to be able to enact some of these things. Carbon pricing, absolutely, we need a price on carbon. We absolutely feel very strongly about that. That's a very difficult thing to do politically.
Alice?
So education, we started off with that in the first film about how important it is. Energy literacy, so many people don't know where the energy comes from. It's generally cheap in most places and most times of the year. It can spike around the country, and that's when people think about it. It's like when the price of gas went up, people started buying hybrid cars. When it went back down, those car sales dropped. You know, we have very short-term memories in the United States, like what's bothering us at the moment. Ebola was, you know, hip and cool in the press a week ago, and now we don't hear about it. So I think what you all can do, you all are thought leaders. You're here in this room. You know, demand that the media present a true spectrum of what is happening and not taking up, you know, the far left or the far right, but talking about the actual facts and letting you all decide what we need to move forward. You don't need to be handed a designer, I call it designer news. You know, you deserve real news, so I think you can demand that. If you have a neighbor or a cousin who's getting incentives to get solar on their roof and you don't, I think you should call your mayor's office and ask why. I mean, we have such a disparate way we handle energy and incentives right now, and it's because it's up to every mayor, every governor has a different plan. So I think the public can really demand a shift in the market. And you know, whether gas is used or not will probably largely depend on, you know, what happens with the other choices. People need to demand that their utilities give them choices. That's happening in some parts of the country, and it's not happening all in others. So you all have a strong voice. You know, America just made its voice known on Tuesday, and every election makes people think of, you know, rethink about how involved they want to be. And you know, some of you in this room should probably run for office one day if anyone wants to talk about that. I ran when I was 42, so don't think you're too old. So, you know, you need to take part in this, and the fact that you're here is a great step. But the education is absolutely huge. We have a contract now with, or an agreement with natural science museums about energy literacy, starting in, you know, kindergarten, and with adult programs. And again, when you think about where the energy future is going to be in every single aspect, those are jobs. You know, we talk about having, you know, what our economy is going to look like in a job shortage. We need to be educating our young people now for the jobs of the energy future.
Yeah. You know, and it's interesting because even with the rational middle, and we will get calls in our office where a staffer is calling us and asking us to give his senators cover. You know, and I'm not even sure what that meant at first, like to give somebody cover, like what does that even mean? And he's like, do you have a film on drilling? And I'm like, well, yeah, sure, you can download it for free. He's like, thanks. You know, and then of course, you know, the next guy calls up and he wants to know about conservation efficiency. So it's interesting to, of course, start with those STEM programs, but I'll tell you, there are plenty of people right up the street that don't seem to know a lot about energy, for better or worse. Alan, do you want to?
Yeah, I could jump in on that. I think the biggest tragedy from my perspective as a Washington, D.C. observer and participant is the polarization and the politicization of the science of global warming. Why is this a Republican versus a Democratic issue? And it absolutely is. On surveys that we've done, you can see that the single best predictor of whether a person believes that there's global warming and that we have a role in causing that is what political party you're affiliated with. This is incredibly depressing to me, and honestly, I have to leave it to others to say how to break through that. But certainly, the government and the Congress, state government levels, and all of you, and the general public has to have a role in that. And it works the other way too. So I do a lot of work on shale gas economics and risks and regulation. And I really do believe, at least over the next few decades, shale gas development can be done sustainably. And in my circle of friends that are mostly liberal Democrats, it's Washington, D.C. after all, and outside the Beltway, they look at me like I've lost my mind. You're for shale gas development? You don't want to ban it? So it really does work on both sides. And I think maybe a recognition of that can help move towards the rational middle.
There we go. Another one. Somebody ring a bell. Steve, and you guys start to think about your questions, and I'll be jumping down to get them answered from these guys. Steve, again, going back to those roles of the public, the corporation, and the government.
Yeah. First, let me respond to something Alan just said. Very interesting that I mentioned earlier. The shale revolution occurred on private land. Didn't occur on federal land. If the shale resources were on federal land, we wouldn't be talking about a shale revolution today because it would have never happened. So I think we all ought to thank our lucky stars that all these shale formations are on private land. Yeah, we got to educate the public. You ask most of the public where electricity comes from, they say the switch. So we really need to educate them on where energy comes from. Jobs are very important. I want to give you a very interesting statistic from a couple of years ago. Usually, graduates of Harvard University, on average, earn more than graduates from any other college in the country. A couple of years ago, that changed. And can anybody guess what was the leading school? It was the South Dakota School of Mines.
I was going to say the Colorado School.
Yeah. And the reason is it's because they were turning out geologists that were going to work in the oil and gas industry. All right, so when we think about jobs, the shale revolution is providing jobs. Since the beginning of 2007, jobs in the oil and gas sector have increased by over 50%, while jobs in the rest of the economy have stayed flat. So when you think about an economic driver, the shale revolution has been the economic driver in the United States. As far as policy goes, we have a dysfunctional energy policy here in the United States. In the federal government, there's no lead on energy policy. Everybody thinks the Department of Energy should be that lead, but the Department of Energy is largely an R&D shop. And so there's really no one sort. When you go to Capitol Hill, it's the same thing with the committee structure. So there's really no one focal point for energy policy in the United States, and that's, I think that's something that needs to change. And the last thing I'm going to say is, in a much broader context, is that our energy policy in the United States has been for decades based on the idea of scarcity, energy scarcity. And now we're entering an era of energy abundance, and our policy has not kept up. We essentially have a disco-era energy policy. And we need to change that if we're really going to take advantage of the opportunities before us.
Okay, now questions. And I'm going to do this, letting Bill point.
That young gentleman right there with his hand waving.
No, this one. I'm going to do this Phil Donahue style. So, and I'm so glad. I actually did a tour event at a university, and I said, I'm going to do this Phil Donahue style, and it was like crickets. They're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Here we go. Yeah.
My name's Colin Schott. I'm from the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. And my question revolves around the IPCC's fifth assessment report, and specifically the findings of Working Group 1, which is the working group that covers the physical science of climate change. And my question is about some of their troubling conclusions regarding the temperature threshold, I think until the end of the century, and the fact that they've lowered it to, or that they're thinking about lowering it to 1.5 centigrade. And my question is, should the energy sector, and if it's practical, I mean, if this presentation taught us anything, it's that obviously this stuff takes a lot of time to do. Should the energy sector and policymakers change the calibration of designing the transition to low carbon energy in response to the WG1 findings, and if so, how?
Thank you. Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, I can do it. Yes. I think I know what you're talking about and asking. So the IPCC, there's some scientists that think 2-degree warming is too much. So want to reduce that threshold down to 1.5 or 1. Well, we're already going to blow past 2. So then it becomes a question of, are these merely aspirational goals you're going to set, or are these real goals? And if they're real goals, then they should be attainable and not merely aspirational. So I guess I would like to see it, people around, scientists around the world admit we're not going to meet this goal, and maybe that scares the bejesus out of a bunch of people, which would be a good thing, and then maybe set a goal that's actually attainable, so higher.
Ready?
Karen first from Western Massachusetts in the council there. In the 1970s, this is a question about facts, which I've heard very little of in this meeting so far, real hard facts. In the 1970s, I was coming home because I was working in the nuclear power industry, and the head of the largest utility in the country happened to be on the plane next to me. And he was really struggling. He said to me, you know, one of the biggest problems that I face and that we all face in the industry is that no one can or wants to be open about the number of deaths and illnesses from energy production and mining and use in our country. At that date, people were dying because they were frozen because of poor energy production. Somebody earlier mentioned it. Question to this group: who is tracking the number of illnesses and deaths per year in each state and country by energy source from creation to usage? I do know that the industry has tracked this. Who's tracking it publicly today?
I think it's done state by state and depending on their rules. But I will say, and putting my Colorado hat back on, Colorado, and I worked on this, and it was such an interesting process because the oil and gas industry fought the development of these rules in Colorado, but now tout them, and we ended up reaching an agreement. But originally, the oil and gas industry doesn't want the public to know what's in the fracking fluid. It's not great stuff. Someone was at a hospital and the nurse and doctors couldn't find out what was in it. So we passed a rule that they could be released to medical personnel, and the industry said, well, the doctor should have to sign a confidentiality agreement in the ER. I mean, things like that, those are conversations. We got beyond that, but the drilling rules are state by state. And yes, their drilling is on private land, but it's because people have mineral rights and they can come knock on your door and say, guess what, we're going to drill in your backyard. Let's make a deal. So there's pros and cons to all of this, but it's such a good point. It's still done state by state and depending on the state rules, and it's probably not tracked very well for any energy industry, not just drilling or coal mining or anything. Associations track it, by the way, but.
I think the Department of Labor would.
Hi, I'm from Massachusetts also. Yesterday I was sitting next to the ambassador from Portugal at lunch. Their largest export is hydroelectric power. Last night we went to the Norwegian embassy residence. They have a zero carbon footprint because of hydro and geothermal.
Nobody here has mentioned those two things. That's, so my one question is, why not, and what would it take for us to develop those? And then my second question, which is a bit of a, I don't know, provocative, I guess, is it really rational to substitute carbon emissions with nuclear waste?
So okay, I'll jump in if no one else is jumping in. So both of the last two questions are really getting at the same issue, which is all forms of energy have advantages and disadvantages. So the ones about coal mining are very well known to people on the job: mountaintop removal, acid mine drainage, as well as the deaths from the air pollution when the coal is burned or any other fossil fuel is burned. And then you just talked about nuclear waste. So definitely this is a big issue, and the dangers that we saw about in Fukushima. But the thing is, we all want our energy. And renewable energies have problems too. There are huge battles over putting the towers, wind towers, on the tops of mountains where they're most effective. And so you'll see places in Europe where they're in the valleys because people don't want their views messed up, where they're half as efficient as they would otherwise be. I mean, you know, all right, it's not nuclear waste issues, but I mean, there are trade-offs, and we just, we're going to have to make them. We're making them already by de facto, but we need to change the equation to give a lot more weight to greenhouse gases.
I think Alan's completely right. There's no such thing as a perfect technology, but you know, it's interesting you raised hydro. A lot of environmental groups don't consider hydro to be a renewable energy source. We're actually tearing down dams in the United States rather than building them, but in other places in the world they are using hydroelectric power to good effect. So, you know, a lot of this is political, quite frankly, and I think we have to get over that.
You can only ask a question if you're not from Massachusetts.
Actually, I'm Jeannie Jones-Manzer from South Dakota, home of South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, not North Dakota where the shale gas is happening. But another area that I didn't think that I heard mentioned was bioenergy, and also dealing with switchgrass, ethanol production, those kinds of things that look at all sides of the equation of developing the energy, from the ethanol production to the use of the refuge that is left over from biofuels. So I'm wondering your opinion of where that stands in an alternative.
Let me take that one, because Shell is actually among the leading producers of biofuels in the world. We have a huge joint venture in Brazil where we're using sugarcane. We're using sugarcane and all parts of sugarcane to produce biofuels. It's a great example of where an existing company like Shell that deals with liquid fuels can very quickly integrate biofuels into the existing distribution network, right? So you talk about the time required to transition to lower carbon fuels. It's a great example of something that is very attractive to a company that can leverage its own capabilities, it can leverage its own infrastructure, its ability to you know, even retail stations, all of that, and very, very quickly just replace one fuel with another, you know, through that system. And we're doing that in a very, very huge way in Brazil, and we're looking for opportunities in other parts of the world to do that. We do not want to impact the food source. We're not big into corn ethanol in the U.S. because of its impact on corn prices and its impact on food prices. So the question again is what trade-offs are we willing to take? And in biofuels, you just really need to be careful in terms of the whole net effect on the food pricing and food availability. So our focus is more so on cellulosic ethanol as opposed to the food itself. Yeah.
And I'll just bring up one other thing. One, I'd note, take a look at the National Renewable Energy Lab website and look at all the research going on there. It's fascinating. But you brought up an important point, and this happens with each of these technologies. If you're talking about compressed natural gas vehicles, which some cities are converting their fleets to, or electronic vehicles or biofuels, we haven't built out the infrastructure yet, so that scares people about investing in something like that. So, you know, it's sort of the cart before the horse issue. So the country has to really think very strongly about how they're going to build out that infrastructure. I mean, and once storage becomes more efficient in cars, electronic vehicles will obviously be able to go farther, but it's just another sort of, you know, another add-on complication of this. Again, that takes a more strategic policy to make happen.
Can I just add on to that? I think it's very important. We talk about energy transition, but in order for a transition to occur, you need infrastructure. And quite frankly, we have a big problem here in the United States, and actually in many countries, but we have a big problem here in the United States getting things sited and permitted in a timely fashion. The Keystone Pipeline is sort of the poster child for this, 6 years for an environmental review. If you want to build a transmission line that crosses state lines, you're looking at perhaps a decade to get the thing sited and permitted for a project that might take a year and a half to build, right? If you're looking at the shale revolution, we need to build pipelines, right? If you're looking at renewables, you know, we have a lot of wind in North and South Dakota, but nobody lives there. Well, I should say nobody. Yeah. Well, we found the one person who lives here. But there's a lot of more people who live in Chicago. And so you've got to build transmission lines from where the power is being produced to where the demand load is. And if you can't get those things sited and permitted in time, you might as well forget it. So in order for the transition, any transition to happen, you really need to be able to build the infrastructure. And one final example, LNG facilities. We build LNG facilities at one point to import natural gas. Now we're going to be exporting liquefied natural gas. We got to get those facilities up and sited and permitted if U.S. business is going to be able to get into the market in a timely fashion. So I can't emphasize siting and permitting enough. It's one of the things that doesn't get a lot of. It's not sexy. It doesn't get a lot of press. But it's one of the most important aspects of an energy transition.
That's great. We have 2 more questions in the back, but as they're kind of going through their questions, you're going through their answers, we'll close with you guys coming up with that one thing that we need to do to move the energy future today. Like, what's that one thing we have to do today? So that's going to be your final question, but here are 2 final from the audience.
Phil who? Ed Martins from World Boston. You were right. You made the point about what holds back renewables is any kind of battery store or energy storage. I'd be curious. Elon Musk of Tesla is right now building a huge battery factory, which will increase battery output by 4 or 5 times world some magnitude. Like if I'm wrong on the numbers, please correct me. All I know is what I've read in the papers about it. I don't have the technology. Is this a big breakthrough, and is it now making this possible?
I'll jump on that only because DOE helped start Tesla with the loan program. And by the way, they paid back their loan 9 years early. So it was a great example. A great example of how the loan program can help launch these and commercialize technologies. But I think there's a number of breakthroughs that are happening across the country that I think we're at this tipping point where I think we can leap forward. And again, it'll be how you commercialize that, how you enter it into the marketplace, so it's affordable across the line. I mean, Tesla's cars are still probably out of the reach of most people, but that will change over time. And that technology, I mean, we have the Leaf now, the electronic car, the Leaf. And, so you're seeing this technology spread more into middle America, and that's what's going to take some time, but I think we are very close.
Hi, my name is Jalen Evans, a scholarship recipient from the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. I have a question about urban sprawl. What kind of initiatives are being taken to address the urban sprawl? In Pittsburgh, we have a pattern of the middle class going predominantly away from the cities, and that's a pattern all across America. Furthermore, what kind of initiatives are being placed on the private sector automobile industries, because urban sprawl creates a larger dependency on automobile transportation?
Such a great question. Anyone else? Why don't you go ahead? Yeah.
Well, I'll take the second part of that. I'm not even sure if the first part is right.
I think.
I think there's been a lot of movement back. I know I would have moved back into the city, actually. But we haven't talked much about government policy and vehicles. And in the United States, we do have coming very stringent fuel economy standards, which are really greenhouse gas emission standards equivalently, on cars and light trucks, and then also a separate rulemaking on heavy-duty trucks, which is the first time ever we had that started a couple of years ago, and there's another round coming. So we're going to from somewhere like 27.5 miles a gallon in the light-duty the cars up to 55 by 2025. And there's going to be a very interesting process in another year or so to review all that's known about trying to get to that level and see if it's actually going to be endorsed by EPA and the Department of Transportation. So that's something to look for in the future.
And I'll just say, going back to my point before, on things like this, best thing you can do is, one, vote and call your mayor. But where we've had successes in different cities, and again, this is very disparate across the country, you've had a diverse set of folks come together and help create a plan and support for things like a bonding tax. Because you can't go out alone and make something like that happen. You have to have business councils, chambers. Having a walkable city, that's the best thing for a local economy that you can have. Making people feel safe, that they can walk around, either come in on transit or park their car and not have to see it all day and visit your city. But it takes cooperation across the board, and that's something that, again, citizens and private sector can help demand.
So, we have the Harry Potter wand right up here with us, and we're going to come up with that one thing that we need to sort of get done or start getting done today as far as advancing towards that energy future. What is that one thing? Steve, you want to start?
Yeah, I think for me, in the context of the United States, it's pretty simple. We've got to embrace abundance. We've been living with the policy of scarcity for far too long. We have to start rethinking the way we approach energy policy. Most people don't know it, but when you look at the energy resources in the world, the United States has more energy resources than any other country in the world. The only other country that even comes close is Russia. So we have an abundance of energy here in the United States, but we're not getting to it efficiently. So I think really if we want to embrace an energy future that's going to be good for our economy and good for our energy security, we have to ditch the idea of scarcity, embrace abundance.
Alice?
I think I'll go back to a point that you made earlier because I thought it was just so important. If I had a magic wand, I would have our elected officials view how to move forward based on the facts, not based on maybe who's writing them a check. The public always worries about this, what the effect on that on people's decision makings, and look at this as an all of the above. Because right now people are choosing sides, and I think they're doing that completely wrongly. And just move forward. And why are we arguing whether climate exists or not? And we have to move forward, not backward. And this should not even be part of the conversation anymore. So elected officials need to base their movements on fact and what works in our market and move forward.
Greg?
And I'm going to say my one thing in just a second, but first he prompted me just to make sure that folks understand one major oil company's position on climate change. Shell has absolutely no issue with climate science and the belief that man-made emissions or man-generated emissions are impacting the climate. So that is an absolute position that we are, way beyond that and moving toward the future. So I would say the one thing for me is a price on carbon. If we establish a price on carbon, we start to stimulate the innovation, the market forces that will drive us to the better solutions. And we don't have to worry as much on getting the policy right in terms of picking winners and losers, because you'll never get that right given the evolution of technology, because it'll never keep up with technology. But let market forces do it. The reason why shale gas happened in North America is because of market forces. Private land ownership generates a market force. That is a market force, right? And that certainly helped to propel it. But it's happening in many, many other places right now. In Canada, there is no private mineral ownership, and it's happening as much in Alberta and British Columbia as it is in North Dakota. And but it was that market force of private land ownership that helped to get it beyond its incubation stage. So, price on carbon, let innovation, let market forces help to advance the technologies and advance the energy sources that we need.
Okay, Alan, bring us home.
So here you have the big bad oil company here saying, tax my product. Please recognize how amazing that is. And then you have here, I'm a representative of the research community, the academic community, who does research on this, and all I can say is amen. Amen.
Well, I got to tell you, yeah, give these guys a huge hand. This was absolutely amazing. And I got to tell you, thanks to all of you, these questions were incredible. I got to say, I am so looking forward to this tour. I hope some of you guys can join us because this is an amazing crowd. And again, give these guys another big hand. Give yourself a big hand. Thank you so much.